forthcoming improvements contemplated in both of the bilateral agreements. Now, these amendments were identified through both an internal review in the Ministry of Education and through consultation with the regulated childcare sector. I'd also like to thank the Ministry of Social Services and our early learning and childcare stakeholders who provided input on these amendments. These amendments will further support families, early childhood educators, and continue to drive strong economic growth in the province. And, Madam Chair, I'm pleased to answer questions related to Bill number 143, the Child Care Amendment Act 2023.
Thank you, Minister. I will now open the floor for questions. Ms. Conway.
Thank you, Chair. Minister, just wondering if you could provide a bit more detail about the stakeholders that you consulted with on the Act. That would be great. Thanks.
Maybe I'll just start, Madam Chair, and then I'll let both maybe Samina and or Janet, speak more directly to the external stakeholder consultation. Obviously, as I mentioned in my opening statements, many of these amendments came to be through, again, folks like we have here today, internal ministry staff who work with the childcare sector partners on a daily and weekly basis. Obviously, we did a significant external stakeholder consultation as well and received numerous supportive responses to these amendments. Again, folks like Georgia LaValle from SICA, the Saskatchewan Early Childhood Association, several individual childcare providers, both home providers, but also center providers as well. I'm just looking here at the list of folks that we consulted with. YWCA Regina, as well as we know the YMCA and the YWs in this province are some of the largest childcare providers in terms of number of seats. And so again, certainly significant consultation out there with external partners. Sammy, Janet, do you have anything to add to that?
The Child Care Act is, of course, terribly interesting to early learning and childcare stakeholders, and we've spent considerable amount of time with them over these past few years as we've been implementing the agreements. The invitation list went out to quite a number of stakeholders, and a relatively small number attended the very specific consultation on this, but it was very positively received, I think so.
As the critic in the area, I also struggled with that. It's not terribly interesting, and I recognize that this act is a whole lot of housekeeping, but it does kind of fit into that larger picture of pursuing and hopefully achieving some of the targets and goals outlined on the provincial federal in the provincial federal agreement. I guess what strikes me as one of the most substantive changes is the stuff around wages. It gives obviously the ministry authority to, I'm guessing that the crux of those changes are allowing you to set that wage grid that we've heard so much about. So I recall last estimates in 2023, I believe the wage grid had still not been announced. I had been told the year previously that it was on the way and that it would be released that year. That was 2022. I still haven't seen a wage grid. Minister, can you speak to that? Where are we at with the wage grid, given that wage grid will have such a impactful role on being able to retain workers in the childcare sector?
Thank you, Madam Chair. In response to the question, I mean, obviously, you know, certainly as I've met with childcare centres around the province, you know, obviously attracting people to the sector is a major priority, and certainly to do that, there needs to be competitiveness from a wage perspective in order to recruit and retain, you know, quality people as early childhood educators. You know, as you know, and again, the government through the agreement has done several things, whether that's you know, different workforce grants or to provide training to individuals seeking to get into the early childhood education space. So in practice, and I mean, the member would know that, you know, there's been a couple of wage enhancements now provided for through the money coming from the agreement. You know, wage enhancements up to an additional $7.50 per hour in some cases, and what we've done with those wage enhancements is really start to delineate between the 3 levels of ECE education, you know, 1, 2, and 3, and so in essence, in practice, there's been a wage grid developing already in practice. Again, what this legislation allows us to do is gives us the authority to have something more formal in place when it comes to a wage grid, but again, because through the wage enhancements that have been provided, that is creating the grid where there's delineation between the levels of education and starting to provide for that. Sammy, is there anything else that you want to add, particularly on that point?
Minister, can I just a quick reminder that to have your officials introduce themselves when we start? Thank you.
Samima Haq, Ministry of Education. And I would add to what the Minister has already said is this is a fundamental change in the childcare sector for this province, from going to predominantly unregulated childcare sector to a highly regulated childcare sector. As part of that transformational change, the workforce needs to be developed. We didn't have a lot of workforce with the certification. So it's been important for us to kind of invest in getting the workforce to be trained and seeking those certifications and provide a balance between the wage enhancements as well as the educational opportunities and support for those opportunities. So there is a level of internal equity as well within the workforce as we move through that, because many of the traditional long tenure childcare workers did not have previously any certification. So as they seek certifications, we've also continued to provide support through wage enhancements, workforce grants, as well as educational opportunities and support, financial support for those educational opportunities. It's a parallel approach to developing the workforce.
Thank you for that. So I've had the privilege of working on this file for a few years, so I'm very familiar with the file, with the wage enhancements, with some of the training opportunities, with some of the grants. I know, of course, many childcare providers weren't eligible for some of those enhancements for various reasons, and I fully acknowledge there have been steps in the right direction. But what I've been hearing clearly from the stakeholder, from the sector, is this need for a formalized wage grid. And during my conversations in the past with the previous Minister of Education, I was led to believe that a more formalized wage grid would be coming, and based on my conversations with the sector, there are many stakeholders that were led to believe that as well. Am I hearing now that there isn't going to be this formal wage grid coming out? I'm confused. Each time, so in previous estimates, we had conversations about when we might expect the wage grid, and often there were timelines around that. Am I hearing now that a formal wage grid is not going to come into effect? Of course, it's going to acknowledge all of those things that you mentioned, Minister, the differentiation between ECE 1, 2, 3, Director, all of that. I had understood that a wage grid would be coming out as part of this larger work of a funding model and a workforce strategy. Is that not the case?
I would say I don't think that'd be a fair characterization. I mean, again, as I outlined, you know, in practice, what we've done with the wage enhancement grants is, as I said, creating a delineation between the levels and providing some overall structure and really some, getting us to a place where there's knowledge province-wide about where wages are going for those various levels. Certainly, again, with the legislative authority to start, I guess, delivering on parts of the agreement. I mean, again, the formal wage grid is something that we continue to work on. So I don't think it'd be a fair characterization to say that it's not going to happen. It's something that we continue to work towards. As I said, in practice, I think the wage enhancement grants have moved us in that direction. And then with this legislation, I've used the metaphor of building an airplane while you're mid-flight with kind of the regulated childcare space, and I think that's something that, as we continue to move forward with these agreements, we continue to build the airplane. We're still in the air, so we need to continue providing quality childcare around the province and communities to parents and families, and again, I think this. As you outlined, many of the amendments in this act are largely housekeeping in nature, and again, formalize some of the things that we need to do on a provincial level to deliver on the agreements. I mean, I would caution that, again, as I said in my opening remarks, the agreement provides funding to be delivered through the province to the end of 25-26, and so we're mindful of that, and are having discussions with the federal government about ensuring that there's some predictability beyond that. Because again, anytime that we create something that's longer term in mind, we want to know that there's some. We see, to use another aviation example, we want to see that there's some runway there going forward. So we're just mindful of that as well.
Minister, I think I'm hearing that a wage grid will be forthcoming, understanding that there have been wage enhancements as we transition and make steps towards the ultimate goals outlined in that act. When will that wage grid kind of become formalized? When can we expect to see that in the sector?
So as I said to the member in my previous answer, again, we were, with the wage enhancements that we provided, we're working on ensuring that the sector is competitive across other similar type of human service sectors across the province. Again, as we look beyond 2025, 2026, and continue to have conversations with the federal government about what that funding model looks like long term. I mean, a wage grid would be part of that funding model, but again, understanding, so in terms of a specific date, I think that's part of, I would say that's part of the discussions that we're having with the federal government to understand kind of what's coming in so that we can create policy that's sustainable and predictable for childcare operators. I mean, I think, again, I would highlight where we've gotten to now after the most recent wage enhancement grant is a place where, you know, I think very competitive compared to what's going on in Alberta and Manitoba. I mean, looking at you know, Saskatchewan on average is you know, for EC wages is at just over $24 an hour. Manitoba is at $22.26 an hour, and Alberta is averaging $23.68 an hour in the ECE sector. So I mean, certainly, you know, we recognize that there is transiency between Western provinces, and so ensuring what these wage enhancement grants have ensured that we're at a competitive place. But again, to have something more set in stone, I guess, you know, that's the give and take of understanding what's going to be in the sector after 2025, 2026 before we can lock in something more firm on a wage grid.
So no wage grid before the agreement expires?
Well, if we can continue to work with the federal government to, obviously we want to get a renewal agreement signed before the end of the current agreement. That would be the hope from a provincial perspective. Obviously, lots can happen between now and then, but that's certainly what we're working towards in terms of negotiating even our action plan on between now until the end of this current agreement, and then we'll begin to start working on what's beyond that. Again, being mindful from a provincial policy perspective of knowing what's coming down the road so that we can plan accordingly and structure the sector appropriately.
Minister, I'm having difficulty parsing your answer on this. It sounds like a backtrack on that commitment to the formalized wage grid during the life of the agreement. I'm going to bring your attention to the comments of your predecessor. This is April 13th, 2022 in Hansard at Estimates. He indicated, and as you mentioned as well, and as you've noted, this is a quote, "We have made a commitment to develop a wage grid and make progress on implementation, and I would expect that work's going to take us through probably to the end of 2022. Now 2022 came, and the end of 2022 came and went, and I brought the wage grid issue again to your predecessor on, this is April 4th, 2023, and he said, this is a quote, portion of those would be operational. He's talking about operational childcare spaces. Then he says, quote, "That's why we are focusing on the expansion strategy this year, as well as the workforce strategy, as well as things like a wage grid." We still don't have a wage grid. We have wage enhancements. We had those last year. We had those the year before. The sector wants a wage grid because the sector acknowledges that in order to truly get at the quality and retention issues that we see in childcare, we need a wage grid. And the opposition has always been very concerned that this government was quick to announce $10 a day daycare, but when it comes to doing the hard work under this act of expanding spaces and creating a well-trained, quality workforce that is well remunerated and remains within the sector, we haven't seen action on that. And a big part of this is the wage grid. So yes or no, will there be a wage grid before the end of this current, the life of this current agreement, and when could we expect that wage grid?
So, as I said, a lot of the conversation around childcare, I think probably that we'll have today, and we've had in other forums, leads back to, ensuring that we have predictability on the agreement with the federal government going forward. I guess I would just, I would remind the member, to define a wage grid, we are defining specific wage levels for, or specific wage minimums for specific levels of education that are above the provincial minimum wage, right? And so, it's making it clear to operators that here's the minimum for EC1, here's the minimum for EC2, here's the minimum for EC3, and so when it comes to a wage grid, as I said, in practice, we have that now. We're providing these wage enhancements to top up and to ensure that employees in the childcare sector are compensated commensurate to their levels of education. The work I think that perhaps you're referring to, and the work that certainly we are working on getting closer to a resolution on it, is, again, once we get an understanding from the federal government in terms of their plans long-term on childcare, is formalizing the funding model and to make sure that there's some more kind of formal guidelines on that. But again, in practice, as I tried to outline a little bit here, we've, what we have provided through these wage enhancements is essentially a wage grid. Again, compensating different levels of education. So, appropriate to those levels. Maybe I'll just ask Sammy to make a couple more comments on where we're at currently.
Samima Haq, Ministry of Education. From our perspective, when you look at a grid can be defined many ways. As we've developed this sector, we're looking for more and more people to be certified and to seek their different levels of certification from level 1 to 2 to 3. And we are ensuring through our wage enhancement grants to ensure that the operators have the ability to meet the requirements that we've set forward for them for minimum wages for these different levels, and to ensure that the wages are comparative for each level across our neighboring provinces so that we remain competitive for the workforce. In addition to that, we are looking at workforce grants, which allow the operator to determine what additional benefits and enhancements that they want to provide their workforce to allow for recruitment and retention. The workforce grant that we're providing operators is completely flexible and at their discretion as to what kind of benefits they want to provide their employees to support the well-being of the employee, whether it's through different programs, different educational opportunities, workshops, or paid benefits of any kind. So these are recruitment and retention incentives. The operators have been very satisfied with the ability to be flexible in regards to having that workforce grant to add on, workforce enhancement grant to add on to the wage enhancements. So the compensation is set as a grid that's above the minimum wage grid that distinguishes between the 3 levels, is based on a comparison with other jurisdictions, and we continue to look for cost drivers and continue to enhance our provincial supports accordingly. And also, in addition, we've provided an additional grant with the flexibility for the operators to determine other supports they want to provide their employees.
Thank you. Minister, we can have a debate about this idea of a wage grid as a term of art, but this is a term that I have used, and this is a term that your government has used, and it's a term that is used in the sector, because a grant-based model, wage enhancement, these are, while needed, are piecemeal and short-term. And I think the hope is to see us transition to a systemized early learning and childcare sector that is affordable, accessible, and high quality. Eventually, irrespective of how the federal government might feel about that. These are lofty goals, and these are goals that Saskatchewan people deserve to see realized in their province. And part of getting there is to entrench some of this system. And I think that is what the sector is expecting, a wage grid. That's my understanding. So I'm a little concerned to hear that it sounds like nothing further should be expected in the near future, and certainly before 25, 26. I'm going to propose to move away from this topic unless there's something more you want to put on the record. I invite you to do that maybe in answering my next question. But I want to ask next about Section 10, which is the mechanism whereby a child care center, so previously my understanding is the assumption is that a child care center will be governed by a board of directors, the majority of which are parents, who fulfill a certain criteria that existed under the old Act. Similarly, under the old Act, if there wasn't a board made up of parents, there was a parental advisory committee. My understanding is that the change under this current Act is that the minister may exempt a licensee from the requirements of having a parental board of directors or a parental advisory committee if in the opinion of the minister it would cause undue hardship or an exemption is granted, if an exemption should be granted in the public interest. Minister, am I right that that last section is the addition under this Act? And can you talk about why that change and what circumstances you would envision requiring a board of directors made up of parents or an advisory committee made up of parents causing undue hardship and or when it might be in the ministry's when it might be in the public interest for the ministry to grant an exemption in that situation?
So I'll just share, maybe I'll just share some context as to, you know, the reason for Section 10 in the legislation. I mean, I mentioned earlier, for example, I mean, the YMCA and YWCAs are two of the larger, if not the largest, childcare providers in Saskatchewan, and obviously with multiple centres, right? And we're not, you know, as they expand and open a new centre, you know, the ministry is not asking the YMCA or YWCA to change the makeup of their board of directors to necessarily include parents that are there, right? I mean, those are organizations that do multiple things in our community, in our communities, and so, you know, again, Section 10 allows for a larger organization, like using those two for example, to continue with their their planning in terms of board succession and board composition, but ensures that there are parental advisory groups, at the various additional locations that those organizations might open over time. Now, when it comes to, an exemption and, a potential situation where an exemption may be in the public interest, obviously we want to make sure that, you talk about how important accessibility is in the childcare space, and certainly, you and I are both parents of young children. Having the continuity of a childcare facility is absolutely important, and so, but obviously with that, you're going to have some, say there's, a dysfunction and there's now low participation in a board or advisory group. Obviously the ministry, would work on a case-by-case basis to offer an exemption to kind of let that group reform. Otherwise, we don't want to just shut down a child care center because there's not necessarily participation on a board or a parental advisory committee. So, but obviously children age out of child care and new parents are coming in. So again, it's the focus of the amendment is to allow for this as organizations open up multiple locations and allowing for parents to still be involved in the overall governance. And then, as I said, the exemption piece is really to ensure that we can allow continuity of centers and ensure that, if there is all of a sudden there's no participation, then we don't need to say, hey, you're out of line of your license. We've obviously, the continuity piece, and I'm sure you would agree, is important in these sort of situations.
So previous to these changes, centers with multiple locations, were they just required to have one board of directors, or were they required to have board of directors at all of their multiple locations?
Yeah. So yeah, under the existing, no more than 2 centers, under one board of directors. So obviously, we do want to encourage, organizations like the YM and the YW to continue to open spaces. So, again, we think this will allow, again, growth of spaces, of regulated spaces in the sector. Still have to balance that with how do we ensure that parents are involved. If an organization has 5 or 6 locations, we still want there to be parent voice in that. I think that's important. But then again, ensuring that as parents transition in and out, based on their kid's age or, move in or out of a community, that the continuity piece can be preserved.
Yeah, Minister, it just struck me, I guess, that it wasn't long ago that we had an emergency session here about so-called more parental inclusion in children's lives. And it's a bit of a contradiction that you're presiding over this change under the Act that actually allows for situations where there would be less parental involvement. I think that's fair to say. Do you agree?
Well, I don't think that's quite a fair characterization. Again, considering, if a family is accessing $10 a day childcare in our province, are we going to shut down a facility because parents have decided not to be on a parental advisory group anymore? I think this is a reasonable change to really ensure the continuity piece. Obviously, we want parents to be involved in their children's lives, at any stage of whether that's in the early years or whether that's in pre-K to 12 education. We would encourage that, of course, and we hope that parents are engaged. But I think what this change allows is, again, really preserving the continuity of childcare.
Minister, can you just speak to, it does seem that if you can find enough parents to be involved in an advisory committee, it might be reasonable to expect you could find enough parents to be on a board. Can you speak to some of the challenges there that these changes are addressing? You know, I agree with you. We shouldn't be closing down childcare facilities if there's a lack of parental engagement. I didn't know that this was a challenge being faced by some of the childcare providers, a lack of parents stepping up to be part of that process. And if this is a change very much in response to that, it makes sense. But could you speak to that differentiation between the board of directors and the parental advisory committee, and why, if you've got one, why not just make it a board with a little bit more ability to kind of guide and have input in the center?
You know, I'll just go back to, you know, to answer that question, I would say I go back to, you know, my previous example of take YWCA Regina. I mean, obviously that's an organization that does much more than just childcare, but they do operate childcare facilities as well. I mean, the legislation, you know, obviously, you know, we all know the YWCA in Regina does excellent work, and they have done a good job at recruiting people that are interested in that organization and contribute greatly in terms of you know, contributing in a board capacity. I mean, obviously, you know, it'd be great if there were, you know, if the board was filled with parents, but again, if you're running a multifaceted organization, you need different professionals on your board, whether that be someone, a financial or a legal professional, you know, if you're going to run a board for an organization of that size. You know, so again, we have to respect those organizations, you know, structure their board in a way that's reasonable for all the offerings that they do. But when it comes to, you know, an individual facility, again, using the YWCA as an example, I mean, if they have a child care facility in East Regina, there's a requirement to have a parental advisory committee of parents that are whose children attend that facility, and you know, I think that requirement to have parental voices is certainly reasonable, and something that again, as a parent myself with a child, you know, accessing childcare, you know, certainly I'd hope that I'd have an opportunity or a forum to have my voice heard if I had any concerns or, you know, desire to be more involved in my child care facility. You know, and again, going back to the exemption, there's you know, so we require the parental advisory committee, but you know, as families come and go, age out, age in, you know, again, I think the exemption allows some flexibility there to ensure that there's good transition over time.
Thank you, Minister. Am I correct, though, that like with the YWCA as an example, am I to understand that the board of directors of the YWCA, like writ large, was responsible for the childcare, or they would have had a separate board of directors specifically for their childcare, or as you noted, at least one board for two facilities?
Well, again, continuing to use the YWC as an example, and perhaps we should have invited Melissa to committee here today, and she could provide more detailed comments on specifically board governance and organizational governance in her organization. Again, using that example, I mean, my understanding is they would have one board for their whole organization. Obviously, childcare being one of the items or one of the services that they deliver in Regina. A single board for their entire organization. But again, this legislation allows for that parent voice to be heard at each individual childcare center that they may run.
So presently, the overall Y's board of directors had to have a majority of parents with a child enrolled at one of their childcare facilities?
Yeah, to meet the licensing requirements, that would have been the existing requirement. But as we know, we want, with the goal here of making childcare more accessible and expanding it across the province, obviously, at some point that becomes impractical, right? And certainly, again, using the YWCA as an example, and thinking about all the services that they do offer in the city here, it's not necessarily practical for one ministry to determine to them, the structure and composition of their entire board. And I think these changes allow for that parental voice to be present, but without kind of interfering in the operations of the entire organization, if that makes sense.
Noted. I just want to, though, go back to that. Is it not the case that the Act does provide for situations where you won't have a board of directors that are majority parents or a parental advisory committee? That is a possibility now under these changes, that a childcare facility will have neither.
Question?
Correct me if I'm wrong, but the changes introduced under this Act now mean that childcare centers, if they are granted such an exemption, will not need to have a board of directors made up of a majority of parents or a parental advisory committee. So specifically, the Act allows for exemptions of that, so that parental involvement isn't there at either the board level or the advisory level.
Yeah, I mean, if we're in the forest of hypothetical situations, I guess that could happen, but any exemption would be on a temporary basis, and certainly the ministry would work with the operator, to ensure that the parental advisory committee comes back online, or that, if it's a smaller one-off operator, that there would be a return of parents to the board, if that makes sense.
Minister, the change around the board makes a lot of sense to me, and especially with regards to the why. The removal of a requirement that there's an advisory committee is more concerning to me as a parent with kids in licensed childcare. It seems like that would be a very low barrier way to get parents involved. It wouldn't require the commitment of a board of directors. Surely that could be set up in a way that you could get parents' feedback and involvement very easily if done right. So I guess also combined with kind of some of the rhetoric we've been seeing come from your government, and you particularly in your role as Minister of Education, I'm a little surprised by that change, given that an advisory committee seems to be a good solution to some of the challenges you've identified around requiring that a majority of parents with children in the facility be on the board.
Well, certainly, Ms. Conway, as you point out, I'm a strong believer in the involvement of parents in education, and again, what I think this characterizing this legislative change as a work around parents, I don't think is accurate. In fact, I think it actually strengthens the opportunity and the ability for parents to be involved. I mean, you know, if we work on kind of a hierarchy there, it is, you know, if there's no parents on, you know, there's a requirement for parents to be on the board, but if that requirement can't be met, there's a requirement for a parental advisory committee. And, you know, obviously in a very rare circumstance where, you know, again, a parent's child ages out, or, you know, there would be a rare exemption by ministerial order, you know, and certainly the ministry would be working diligently to work with that center and that operator to find parents to be back involved. I mean, you know, another example that we were just talking about was, you know, take for example, if, you know, in the example of a parent that is under the age of 18, maybe by a board's bylaws, they're not able to be a member of the board, you know, and so there's, you know, these sort of situations, you know, they would be odd, you know, not odd, but they would be certainly unique circumstances. And I think what really this legislation is trying to do is to ensure that parents can be involved, but as we expand on childcare across the province, as larger organizations are doing some of that expansion, that, you know, the inclusion of parental advisory committees is a key part going forward. But certainly having the flexibility again in the case of where not meeting these requirements may threaten the continuity of operations. Obviously, we want to make sure that operations can be continued, and we work on you know, engaging parents at that particular center.
Thank you, Minister. Yeah, I mean, I would just push back against this idea that these changes strengthen parental involvement, because they do the opposite. There may be good policy reasons for that, but the involvement of parents in the board of directors and the advisory committee that predated these changes. What these changes introduce is this idea that requirement can now be exempted. So to say that it strengthens parental involvement, I would push back on that strongly. I have a question about exemptions, because actually under the Act I just noticed that, and it kind of maybe makes subsection 3 a bit redundant, but under section 28 of the existing Act, the ministry can really exempt the requirement of any part of this Act at any time, it seems like, if it is in the public interest to do so. I guess this just introduces this idea of undue hardship. Can you speak to what happens once you've granted an exemption for anything under the Act? What then happens? Is there like a review in a year? Or I couldn't find that under the Act. I don't know what's practically done when exemptions are granted under this Act. So could you speak to that?
So exemptions are ideally want to be very specific in regards to exemptions rather than overarching exemptions. This is a very specific exemptions. Again, as the minister mentioned, it's important for us to have parental involvement and their voice heard in the governance process. So this exemption really provides for that very specific rare scenario where there is a situation where we need to address a particular unique circumstance. And in regards to the follow-up process, our follow-up process is to immediately look towards resolution of whatever issue has led to an exemption, and the ideal state is to bring the operator into compliance with the legislation overarchingly and not be in an exemption situation. So these are time-bound, very specific. We're looking to resolve the issue, whatever it may be, and then bringing the operator into compliance into a normal situation where it's operating under the legislation as it exists without the exemption.
Thank you. Am I correct that, am I right? Just, sorry, I looked more closely at the Amendment Act than the original bill. Am I correct that those strict timelines and those steps that you've described are not in the regulation? That's just, is that fair to say that's just Ministry of Education policy?
Procedural elements that we would address through policy and our standard operating procedures.
Does the ministry track data on how many exemptions are granted under the Act and for what requirement is being exempted?
Exemptions are dealt with at the consultant level. We don't consolidate them centrally, but exemptions are a very temporary situation and they are an active file. Our consultants work on them until the issue is resolved and the operator is in compliance.
So, Minister, if an exemption was granted for having parental inclusion in a childcare facility, that wouldn't be centralized or dealt with by your ministry. It would be left to an individual consultant to address that. It wouldn't be tracked by your ministry. It wouldn't be dealt with by staff of the ministry. It would be dealt with by consultants. Is that correct?
Your support for parental involvement is noted. I'll take note of that here at committee today, and thank you for that. You know, as Mima just outlined, again, any exemption is temporary. That's based on an active file that is managed at the consultant level. I mean, these consultants are Ministry of Education staff. Again, these files are worked on through each individual consultant, rectified, and then the exemption is no longer necessary. But certainly, I mean, with any part of the legislation, I know. Again, I've spoken with consultants on different files, and it's obviously consultants are working diligently to bring, if there's anybody out of compliance in a particular area, working with those centers to bring them back into compliance.
Minister, one concern I have is the intense workload of consultants is well known. How do you know that these are being worked on and rectified if they're not being centralized or tracked in, like, centrally?
Education. The work of our consultants is complex, and they are dealing with facilities that are operating all across the province and often facing some challenges that are unique to their particular situation. So when there's an issue like that, we trust our consultants, and we expect that they're going to try to resolve them as quickly as possible, work with the facility, figure out a way to get the whole situation back into compliance. Sometimes that doesn't work out, and then we need to escalate it within the ministry, and so we have a structure that involves program managers that work directly with the early learning and childcare consultants. Again, many situations would get resolved then at that program manager level. Then we have a director who's responsible for childcare operations, and that position certainly would deal with some situations like that. Absolutely. When on the rare occasions that wouldn't get resolved, then it would be escalated to the executive director level, and so that would be to myself. And I would see very few things that come to me because they have been able to be resolved at the local level. There are exemptions that we track. So, for example, we track early childhood educator exemptions, and because those take a little longer. So, I'm speaking of if someone doesn't have their ECE1, right, but they're working on getting their ECE1, so we can still ensure that the facility can hire that person and work with them, but it just won't be resolved very quickly. So we certainly do track to make sure that we're counting, those sorts of things.
So you track exemptions for the workforce when you don't have like a certain level of EC1s, 2s, and 3s. That's data you do track, correct? Can you give me examples of other exemption scenarios that come up on a fairly regular basis?
Could be any number of things.
So as we've mentioned, and I just want to reaffirm this, that exemptions are not common. Exemptions are very rare. The most common within those rare exemptions would be where we would increase the number of spaces that a licensee is allowed to have due to some temporary issue in a center that's close by. So if there is a reason that a center in town X has to close due to structural issues or something else that they need to address right away in order to accommodate the displaced children, we would temporarily provide an exemption to surrounding childcare centers and increase their allocation for childcare spaces, provided they meet the other requirements and can get the workforce, and allow the center that's affected to address the issue and take the remedial action until the children can return to their regular spot. That is the most common example, I would say. But in those cases, as Janet has mentioned, we work diligently, and there is very regular communication between the consultant and the program manager and the operator as to how they're addressing the issue, where they are with their remedial action, what progress they've made, and how soon the children can be expected to be back in their regular center.
Thank you. So, for example, at estimates, if I were to ask how many exemptions were granted in the last year around this issue of spaces, would you have tracked and be able to say X amount, this is where and this is why and this is how quickly it took to resolve any of that?
We could make our best effort.
It sounds like you do track exemptions to some extent in a way that, you know, you could be providing some data at these kinds of opportunities.
It is a very paper-based system. Again, I would say that, you know, this sector has very passionate workers, whether it's the external workforce or the ministry workforce, and so addressing any exemption situation is a key priority for the team, and they continue to look at it until the issue is resolved. This is why this has never been an issue where we've had to track, because it's been an open file for longer than a few days to a week. But certainly even with the paper-based system, we could make our best efforts. The reason we track the exemptions related to workforce specifically are because there is an expectation right at the start of that exemption that this will take some time. These individuals are in the workforce, they're working full-time as they seek their certification level. So to support the workforce development, to support that they get their certification and are eligible for those wage grants, we want to make sure that we support them through this time period. That is usually the most extended time period that we see an exemption for. The others are very, very temporary.
Thank you. Yeah, I didn't expect to ask questions about exemptions. I kind of stumbled into the topic and realized it's not something I know that much about, so thank you for those answers. The term public interest, it comes up in the provision we were just discussing, and it comes up in other places throughout the Act. And then the new exemption possibility for parental advisory committees and parental board of directors. Also, there's an opportunity for exemption under where it would cause, quote, undue hardship. So that's kind of a new concept introduced under the Act. So I'm just wondering if the ministry has a working definition of public interest and undue hardship.
You know, so the terms that you you've outlined, I mean, certainly I'd say we'd have a strong degree of trust in our consultants in the ministry in terms of, helping to, evaluate a situation and determine what is in the public interest. And obviously when we talk about public interest in the context of early years care, early years education, it's really around child safety, right? And ensuring that children have a safe place, to be going every day. So, again, so public interest, in that regard, that's obviously one of the key hallmarks, is ensuring that children are safe, whether they're receiving childcare in Moose Jaw or Regina or Buffalo Narrows, and when it comes to undue hardship, again, I think, placing a high degree of trust in our consultants to evaluate situations, knowing that, there's going to be situations that our consultants come across that we haven't seen yet in other communities or elsewhere in the province. And, the conversation that we had earlier about continuity of care, right? Again, we don't want to create undue hardship where, the continuity of an operation could be affected, because again, then that becomes against the public interest in that community, say, for example, right? So certainly I would say, the definite, how we would define public interest and undue hardship, again, I've got a high degree of trust in the consultants and the early years team in the ministry to, as they work through individual situations with individual operators, to raise issues that, where there may be, public interest issues or issues of undue hardship, and then so we can evaluate, if an exemption is necessary, for example, if we're going to talk about exemptions, or talk about how we will work with that individual operator to get to a resolution.
Minister, I'm sure you have every good reason to trust and put faith in ministry staff and consultants. My question is a little more straightforward. I'm just wondering if there are guiding documents that exist within the ministry around how to define and conceptualize those concepts of public interest and undue hardship.
Well, again, I would...
And I guess follow up to that, do those documents exist, and would they be available to share if they do exist?
Yeah, those guiding documents, don't exist in this context, again, because our consultants are dealing with, a variety of instances and situations around the province in a variety of communities, and certainly we don't want consultants to be in a situation where they're not able to work towards what may be public interest in an individual community. So again, I think I do have good reason to trust our consultants to ensure that those concepts are met. And I would say too, I mean, there are manuals and other documents in place that childcare operators around the province work from in terms of understanding how to operate their facility. And I would say that those manuals do offer some broad guidance in terms of what is in the public interest for children and families.
Of course, Minister, under the Act, it's the minister that grants the exemption under the public interest. So can you speak a little more to how that public interest is conceptualized under the Act?
you know, ultimately, as the member points out, I mean, authority lies with the minister, you know, on exemptions. You know, certainly there are examples where I've delegated that authority to officials within the ministry who are dealing with operators on a more day-to-day basis. I mean, but certainly when it comes to, you know, me evaluating any exemption or public interest, obviously, you know, it's, as I said earlier, you know, the wellness of the child, the wellness of the family, certainly the continuity of the child care operation, and ensuring that operation, if it is a safe place for, you know, child and family, that it can continue to serve many families in that community. So, you know, again, there's been minor circumstances where I can think of where, you know, I've delegated authority to officials to deal with the situation, you know, bring somebody back into compliance. Obviously, for any larger instance, you know, when it comes to child safety, that you know, that would be my purview and my authority to grant any exemptions if I deemed them reasonable.
Thank you, Minister. I want to just shift gears here for a moment and look at Section 18. This is the section of the Act that deals with situations where a license can be amended, suspended, or cancelled if the minister considers it to be in the public interest to do so. Sorry, just bear with me for one moment. So the existing section is amended. This is an interesting change because it brings about more strict requirements and timelines around how to then deal with that suspension or cancellation of a license. I want to ask you, last time we had an opportunity to ask questions about this subsection, we spoke about Grace Ministries and their childcare facility, and I asked whether their license had been cancelled given the pending class action lawsuit related to Legacy Christian School. And at that time, Simbo Alubobokun was still the director of that childcare facility, and the ministry had not seen fit to suspend or cancel the license of that childcare facility. Is there any update on that? I know that your predecessor had made some comments about what might happen if certain things came to pass. Is that still a licensed childcare facility directed by Simbo Alubobokun?
So the child care facility that you've asked about, it is still licensed. It's not being operated by those individuals any longer that are accused in the litigation. Those individuals are not allowed on the property during any operating hours where there may be children present. There has been increased oversight from the ministry at that particular facility in terms of the ministry staff attending all the board meetings, increased visits both announced and unannounced, unannounced meetings with the parents at the facility, and I would just confirm that there's been no complaints from the parents of the facility in terms of the quality of care that children are receiving there. So there is that site is still operational, still licensed, obviously with some pretty significant conditions on the operation, and it was the license overall is it's conditional as well in terms of them continuing to meet those standards. And again, the ministry, I would say, is that would be a high degree of involvement from the ministry in terms of ensuring oversight there.
So when I last had an opportunity to ask questions, those conditions were in place, and I was told that oversight was also in place. But Simbo is still the director of that childcare facility, correct?
That individual is no longer on the board, no longer working at the facility, to my understanding.
No involvement in, okay. Okay.
Again, there's, sure you can appreciate that the level of oversight is it's important work being done by the ministry, but it's not, it's fairly significant work undertaken by ministry officials to ensure child safety and child wellness going forward. So those are pretty significant conditions, I would say, for an operation. So.
One of the gaps that I've noticed, just kind of in consideration of that case, which at the time I was surprised that it didn't meet that definition of being in the public interest to suspend the license when that class action came about, and then since then when one of the folks has been charged criminally. But one of the gaps I've identified is just that in terms of certification of early learning educators, of course the ministry issues those certifications, and my understanding is that in an unfortunate situation where an ECE was, for example, convicted or charged with assault or child abuse of some kind, there actually isn't a mechanism under the Act to revoke or suspend those certificates. Can you speak to that, Minister, and maybe why that gap isn't addressed under this amendment, or sorry, this Act?
So the certificate, I think there's a delineation we need to make clear. I mean, the certification piece, it's kind of like a, and I can't remember your post-secondary history, but I mean, I say you have a BA, and then you commit a crime of some sort. Nobody can take your BA away necessarily. So I mean, the certification, the certification is granted when someone provides proof that they've completed, X, Y, and Z. So where we do have authority and to manage, manage potential risks are really around the operation. So it's not necessarily the certification that that gate would be at, it would be at the operation point. So, sure, they still have completed, this piece of schooling or this piece of education. Can't take that away from somebody, they've completed that. But when it comes to their eligibility to work in the sector, that's where the ministry has the ability to restrict that.
Thank you, Minister. Just backing up for one moment, the childcare facility that we were just discussing, is it still run by Grace Capstone Ministries?
Yeah, to our knowledge, and our understanding, Grace Capstone Ministry is still the operator, but those individuals in question are no longer on the board of that organization.
They're no longer directors of the Grace Capstone Ministries, just not talking here about the Child Care Center at all, but Grace Capstone Ministries. They're no longer involved in Grace Capstone Ministries. That's
our understanding, that according to ISC documents, they're no longer directors of that organization.
Is it fair to say that a lot of the changes, or many of the changes we see under this Act are designed to decrease barriers, be it to expand spaces, to expand access, trying to, I think of allowing, we look at subsection 7, which allows child care centers, for example, the authority to operate more than one facility. Obviously, that's a common sense change to allow expansion. And I'm getting head nods. I think we can agree that a lot of these changes are with an eye to reducing barriers to some of the goals under the federal provincial agreement. And I've had a lot of conversations with your predecessor about, the need to expand spaces and some of the movement that there's been on that. And at the time, we talked about home-based daycares and the fact that they were sort of the low-hanging fruit. Licensing those facilities would allow, it was a quick and kind of easy way to expand the licensed childcare spots. I think it's fair game to ask about this because we are opening up the Act very much with this view to expand access. I sent a letter to yourself and some of the officials back on February 22nd, 2024 about an individual who's running a home childcare facility here in Regina. And just to kind of provide some context so that folks, reading this a day or a year or 50 years from now know what I'm talking about. This individual is running a home childcare facility. She's got 8 kids in her care. I had an opportunity to speak to some of the parents of some of those kids. They're very happy with her level of care. She has one of her ECE designations, I believe. She was born, I believe, in Cuba. I hope I'm getting that right, and came to Regina a few years ago. She's very committed to staying here, and in an effort to kind of make the childcare facility more sustainable for herself and access supports that would be available to her, as well as make the cost much more manageable for the parents that she was serving and the family she was serving. She applied to become a licensed childcare facility and went a significant of the way through that process, and then also changed homes, hoping to get more space, and then was told that she didn't meet the definition of resident under the Act, of the current Act that we're talking about. Now, I've gone to that Act, and I tried to provide examples in the letter that I penned to you of other provincial legislation where resident is not interpreted so strictly as to require citizenship. There's lots of, or permanent residency, there's lots of examples where that isn't the case. And it just seems to me that this is a no-brainer barrier that we could get rid of. I'm wondering if there's been any thought to that. Does the ministry continue to take the position that resident needs to meet this more higher, more stringent definition, or has there been any change in terms of opening up a pathway to people like this individual licensing their childcare, their home childcare operation?
So, Ms. Conway, I certainly did receive your letter and have read through it, you know, the situation and tried to brief myself on the details. You know, going back maybe to the preamble to your question, I mean, obviously, what is in this, these amendments that we're bringing forward, and I think just generally speaking, we do want to lower barriers where we can to increase childcare spaces. Now, I do think, I would also say that some of the amendments that we have in front of us today also speak to quality, right, and ensuring quality and safety. I mean, you know, many parents in the room here today, you know, we understand that these are one of the most vulnerable populations that we deal with from a public policy perspective. And so there is a fine balance, I would say, in terms of, you know, lowering the barriers, but also ensuring that there is, you know, adequate safety procedures. Now, when it comes to residency, you know, and I don't want to get into, you know, too much casework in committee, but the challenge with this particular case and, you know, the residency requirement is obviously we want operators to be able to have a criminal record check and a vulnerable sector check. But again, if people haven't lived in the country very long, it's difficult to have necessarily a high degree of confidence, if you will, in terms of, you know, a relatively newcomer to our province or our country. So that is, I would say, that's the challenge in this specific case. But I do think, Ms. Conway, you have raised, you know, with your letter in this particular situation, you have raised a good point, and I think it's something within the ministry we're trying to see if there's other avenues that we can, again, walk that fine balance that we have, and you know, provide more spaces, but do that with the confidence that that kids will be safe, because obviously that is in the public interest.
Minister, on that safety and quality piece, I think I'm having some difficulty connecting the dots here. Like, this is an individual who has an early learning designation that she got here. She's been here in Regina for 3 years. She has a degree in early learning education. That she would be required to do a criminal record check and a vulnerable sector check. It just seems like one more barrier. And, you know, I hear you. You don't want to be debating casework in committee, but casework is really important when we're talking about legislation, because casework represents the on-the-ground reality of how legislation is making problems better or making problems worse. And I think this is a situation where it's made childcare for these 8 families, all of whom I think would be willing to speak to you about how happy they are with the care that they're receiving, making their situation worse. If it's off the table to consider a change to Section 8 as part of these amendments, you know, I would note that legislation, you know, often goes years without being updated. So this is a really good opportunity to do that. You know, an amendment could be introduced if there's any issue here, although I think under the way that the Act is worded, there's lots of precedent for just your officials giving this a different interpretation. And then also there's the Section 28, which we've talked so much about, which would grant you the ability to issue an exemption for this individual, which would sort of negate some of the floodgates, you know, issues that you've identified with, you know, wanting to maintain quality in this sector. So, you know, I urge you to look at that closely. This is, you know, these real life situations are where what we do in here, you know, it's the rubber that hits the road. So this is precisely the kind of thing we should be looking at when we're talking about legislation.
Absolutely, and as I said in my previous answer, I think you've raised a very valid point in this. And again, since your letter, receiving your letter and reading it through, I mean, we are already having discussions within the ministry about where we find that reasonable place in the public interest. And I mean, like you, I'm very passionate about casework in my own community, because it is where rubber hits the road, and ensuring that we can navigate you know, existing legislation and regulations to a place that's best for the people that we serve every day. So certainly, you know, we'll give Section 8 consideration, you know, with this particular case and this particular woman in your constituency. Certainly we're giving that consideration and understanding, again, how we support her and the families that she serves every day, but also, again, always thinking about you know, the public interest and just being mindful of that. So certainly not wanting to stand in the way of families being served in the province, but just keeping that in mind. So I will certainly commit to you, Ms. Conway, we are giving both the long-term and the short-term consideration on this issue. And I do appreciate you bringing it to our attention, because it is, as the workforce in our province changes over time, I don't.
Sorry, that's me.
It may be an issue that we see in my community in the not too distant future, or other communities. So I do thank you for bringing it forward. Thanks,
Minister. Thank you for those words. I hope this case is given some attention. I'll also note she was kind of well into the process before this was identified, so it might be something, you know, I think it was a bit heartbreaking for her, and she made some material changes relying on the fact that this was a high likelihood. I will just say on this specific case, you know, I think she's actually not a constituent. I think she reached out to me in my role as critic. I'm not sure who her MLA is, but, you know, I would note, like, back when the scandal around Grace Capstones came about, I believe that the thinking within the ministry was to continue funding to that daycare because spots were so hard to come by. And, you know, I just think if we can find a way to give Grace Capstone's ministry that license and keep them operating and give them some oversight and keep those spots open, you know, surely this is a situation that is a real no-brainer. Someone with EC qualification, with a degree, with a proven track record now of years of providing really high-quality childcare within Regina. It would be a shame, I think, you know, 8 spots is 8 spots. And when you look at the fact that we're nowhere near our 28,000 spot goal, you know, everything makes a difference.
Point well taken, and if I'm not being dismissive at all, I hope you don't hear that in my voice. If you can give my office a bit of time with it, we'll certainly, again, we're looking at the short-term, you know, need and also the long-term issue that you've identified, because I do think they're both valid, and we'll certainly endeavor to find a way forward. Thank you, Minister. I actually don't have any other questions, unless you do. I do have one question. Sorry, after having said that I have no more questions, I have one more question that is just a very discrete data point, because, you know, we do acknowledge that some of these changes have been created as an effort to expand licensed spaces. So on that note, I think the last time I asked about where we were at, I was told April 2023 that since March of 2021, we had created 2,124 operational spaces and 4,696, sorry, I forget the word for when they're not operational, they're designated, is that the word? Allocated, sorry, yeah, allocated. Yeah. Could you just provide an update on those two numbers to date from March of 2021? How many spaces have we created, operational and allocated?
And my numbers here I have just until the end of December of 2023. So obviously we're continuing we're now in mid-March, so continuing to work on, but as of December 31st, 2023, 8,656 spaces have been created and 4,345 are currently operational.
Thank you, Minister. I have no other questions. I want to thank the officials that joined us today as well.
Thank you. Are there any further questions from other committee members? Seeing none, we will proceed to vote on the clauses. Clause 1, short title, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 2, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 3, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 4, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 5, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 6, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 7, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 8, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 9, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 10, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 11, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 12 coming into force, is that agreed? Carried. His Majesty by and with the advice and consent of the Legislative Assembly of Saskatchewan, enacts as follows. The Child Care Amendment Act 2023, a bilingual bill. I would ask a member to move that we report Bill number 143, the Child Care Amendment Act 2023, a bilingual bill without amendment. Mr. Fayez moves. Is that agreed? Carried. Minister, do you have any closing comments?
No, I'll just thank the committee and Ms. Conway for your time today, and of course you, Madam Chair, as well as all the staff. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. Ms. Conway, any further?
No further comments, except also to thank all those who joined us today. And you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. The committee will now take a brief pause to change out officials. Thank you.
Guys good to go?
You ready to go? Welcome. I would like to introduce Ms. Nicole Sauer, who will be sitting in for Ms. Mira Conway. We will now move on to consideration of Bill number 138, the Workmen's Compensation Extending Firefighter Coverage Amendment Act 2023. Minister McMorris is here with his officials. I would ask that officials please state their names before speaking, and please do not touch the microphones. The Hansard operator will turn your microphone on when you are speaking to the committee. Minister, please introduce your officials and make your opening remarks.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And so on my left is Drew Wilby, who is the Deputy Minister. And to my right is Phil Germain, CEO of the Workers' Compensation Board. And I have other officials back to my left. And if we call them up to answer, they will introduce themselves and give the answer. So I'm pleased to be here today to discuss Bill number 138, the Workers' Compensation Extending Firefighter Coverage Amendment Act 2023. Get my pages right, sorry. On October 31st, our government introduced Bill 138, which makes several amendments to the Workers' Compensation Act 2013. The amendments came as a result of the recommendations from the Committee of Review, who engages employers, employees, organizations, and the public around the legislation and the workers' compensation system. This review is conducted at least every 5 years from receipt of the last committee's report to ensure that Saskatchewan workers' compensation system reflects the changing needs of workers, employers, and communities. This includes changing the definition of worker to remove executive officers and include students in recognized programs, as well as the ability to add other categories of workers in the regulations. Amend the privacy provision to mirror the Health Information Protection Act, provide for administrative penalties if a privacy breach occurs, and simplify the process for releasing information during reconsideration of or review of a decision or compensation claim. Requiring all appeal tribunal decisions be published, covering the expenses associated with transporting a deceased worker's body to the usual residence outside of Canada, providing compensation to a worker's dependent children when the worker passes away from a non-work-related injury while on compensation, no matter the length of time on compensation. Simplify the medical review panel process, increase the permanent functional impairment award over a 4-year period and indexed afterwards, indexing the independence allowance, and expanding presumptive occupational disease coverage to firefighters to include 6 additional primary site cancers: penile, pancreatic, thyroid, soft tissue sarcoma, mesothelioma, and laryngeal cancer. Madam Chair, our government believes that these amendments will address concerns of injured workers, their families, as well as ensure the ongoing financial stability of employers. I look forward to answering any questions from the committee members to address these changes to the Workers' Compensation Act.
Thank you, Minister. I will now open the floor for questions. Ms. Sauer.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, Minister, for your opening comments. I have several questions about the bill. I'm going to try for ease of all of us go through it from the beginning to the conclusion of the bill as it stands. My first question is related to Section 3 of the bill, which amends subsection 2 sub 1. At sub E, the bill is repealing clause FF of the legislation. Can you provide some clarity to the committee as to why that subsection is being repealed?
Sorry, Philip Germain, WCB. Can you just clarify the section one more time?
Section 3 of the bill, which amends subsection 2 sub 1 of the legislation. I am looking at sub E, which repeals clause FF of the legislation. I was asking why is that being repealed? It's related to post-secondary institutions as a hint.
Drew Wilby, Deputy Minister, Labour Relations, Workplace Safety. I'll apologize in advance for my voice. I was on the hockey bench all weekend, and so it's sort of disappeared on me. So if you need me to repeat something, by all means, please ask. Clause FF is being repealed, and it's actually included in the new section 79.1. As well, there's a new clause, FF.3, which is added to define the term SDLC, which of course is the Distance Learning Corporation.
Thank you. Can you expand as to why that's being repealed?
My understanding of that is because it's being included in the new section 79.1, so it's no longer needed in clause or in the existing clause that it's in FF, and so basically the pieces of that are included as it goes forward through that new section.
Okay, so it's simply redundant at this point then?
Correct.
Thank you. Now, as you mentioned, sub G of section 3 is amending the definition of worker. In the new definition, executive officer has been removed. Can you please explain why?
So in this particular case, the change of the definition is executive officer, and in applying that, it's hard to define which executive officers are actually working in the business as a worker as opposed to being just an independent owner of the business. And so when we compared our legislation to other jurisdictions, most jurisdictions don't cover executive officers or owners of the business. That's done usually through a voluntary process. So we're still making it available to owners or executive officers to voluntarily apply to be covered by the WCB, but it wouldn't be mandatory. And that'll make it easier for them to understand the rules, even for us. Like it's hard sometimes to figure out when you're administering it, which situations apply to which circumstances, because executive directors or directors, officers of a corporation are often paid in very different ways.
You touched on this briefly, but I would like to know more in detail how this change compares to what exists in other jurisdictions. Can you give us a bit of a jurisdictional scan?
And the majority, I think it's 8 jurisdictions right now do not, it's 9 jurisdictions do not cover directors. 3 do, New Brunswick, Newfoundland, and Yukon. And Nova Scotia, sorry, 4 do, and 9 do not.
Do you have any data as to how many times instances of claims by executive officers like this, how often has this issue come up in front of the WCB?
We don't have the data in a sense that it's not clear. When employers report their payroll, they report it as one number. We don't know exactly which workers are covered under which amounts unless we do an audit. So we don't get it broken down by worker versus director. So we don't have that specific data.
How is this flagged to you as an issue?
Well, employers and directors have been bringing this to us and our own staff as an issue for many years. It's been a very challenging piece of legislation to apply. This creates a lot of clarity for our staff and for directors.
So just so I understand, you don't know for sure how many individuals would be impacted by this change?
No.
Okay, thank you.
But I think it would be fair to say that through the review committee, it would have come forward, the latest review, as well as the fact that directors can opt in or out. They have the choice. So it's not excluded or whatever, they have the choice.
Terry now, correct? Yeah. Okay. Moving on to Section 4 of the bill, which amends Section 7 of the legislation. It appears that registered mail has been removed. Can you explain why?
It's largely just a modernization of the legislation. We've been asked why we're not moving towards email and other electronic means, of course, so just with the changing nature of the times, it made sense to do those housekeeping amendments to the legislation as well.
Thank you. Moving on to Section 7 of the bill, which amends, which adds Section 23.1 to the legislation. Can you explain what the current practice is for publicizing appeal decisions?
Sure.
Yes.
So in Saskatchewan, we don't publicize appeal decisions right now.
This appears to leave it a little broad in terms of how this will be publicized. It says, in any manner that the board considers appropriate. Can you explain why this wasn't made more prescriptive?
Part of the decision that we have to do is make sure that we're balancing privacy with transparency in terms of what decisions were made and why, without necessarily violating an individual's privacy and explaining why a decision was made. So there's a process that we need to develop. We don't exactly know today what that process will look like, and we just need to balance the interests of all parties involved.
Challenge of anonymizing decisions, which I think is what you're talking about, but I'm more focused on timelines for publishing and how accessible that publication will be. So where will they be published, and what sort of goal do you have in terms of making those publicly available? Will it be 30 days after the decision is rendered, 45 days, 15 days? Will it be on the website? I see that it could include the website, but will it be on the website? Will it be on Camly? That sort of thing is what I'm more focused on.
And because we don't have the process in terms of double checking the privacy, we don't know what those timelines will look like. I mean, our objective is to publish them as soon as possible. And because this is a new process, we want to make sure we get it right from the beginning and make sure that we're not inadvertently violating people's privacies as we publish it. So I don't know the timeline of it. But I will say that our appeals nationally are the best timelines in the country. So if this process is any indication, our objective is to get them out and readily available, probably through the website as soon as possible. I just don't know if that's 15 days, 30 days, 90 days. I don't know what the appropriate timeline is to execute that process and do it from a quality perspective.
Do you have a timeline for when you're going to figure out internally how that process is going to work?
Yeah, that will be spelled out through the regulations.
The timeline for how the process is going to work, or the timeline for how long till publication?
Both. That's my understanding. Both will. So. As indicated, what we will do is develop the appropriate process first, and then once we understand based on best practice, because there are other jurisdictions that are doing this, so we'll be able to learn from other jurisdictions what they've done, how they've done it, and we'll be able to take that best practice and our process and then embed that into the regulations once we know what that actually looks like.
The process will be spelled out in regulations at a later date, is what you're saying.
That's right.
What is the WCB's timeline for finalizing the process?
We don't have that right now. We're working on the process currently in terms of a legal and policy review, but that process is not in all. We're waiting for the legislation to pass in order to make sure we know exactly what will be passed.
Okay.
And then we are working on it, but nothing is finished yet.
Thank you. Moving on to Section 7, which amends Section 28 of the legislation. This is where all of the new listed diseases are added. We've spoken before about how this will set a very positive precedent for Canada. We're very much excited about this. We too have heard from a lot of individuals, firefighters in particular, who have been advocating for this. It's a very positive step forward. Have heard some feedback from wildfire officers who indicate that there are some cancers that they are exposed to that are not included in this list. Can you provide some commentary as to why those have been left out at this time?
What I would say is that this came forward from the firefighters, professional firefighters, and the firefighters have some concern, and so we've heard that, and we'll be working on addressing those concerns in the real near future. It isn't in this legislation, but that doesn't mean we can't address it in the next legislative cycle.
So I'm hearing it's perhaps in the works and will hopefully be introduced sooner rather than later.
I think that's fair to say.
Okay, thank you. I'm now looking at Section 9 of the bill, which amends Section 5. It repeals Section 45 of the legislation. Can you explain why this section has been repealed? It looks like a service requirement has been removed, and I would like to know why.
Is a modernization piece. The notice is still required. It's just the service of notice being that registered mail piece. So it's all included in that other section.
So this is another redundant section now.
Correct.
Thank you. I'm looking at now Section 10 of the bill, which amends Section 48 of the legislation. I'm just curious if you can provide some information as to what the substance of the change of this section is. It appears to me that it's adding the employer to who will be served with reasons. If I'm incorrect, please correct me. And if that's the case, why has that change been made?
And is a modernization. What that's doing is amending to standardize the service of documents as per Section 178.1.
Has the employer always been served in the past?
I'm seeing a nod from Phil, so I believe the answer is yes.
Thank you. I was waiting for that nod to make it onto Hansard. Thank you for that.
We'll formalize the nod.
Thank you. Okay, I'm moving to section 11, which amends section 59 of the legislation. This is in relation to the medical review panel. It appears that some changes are being made which will make it more difficult for employees to access. Can you explain what change is being made in this section and why?
So the changes in this section are intended to make it easier for injured workers to access medical review panel by virtue of expanding which doctors in which areas they can access those from, whether Regina or Saskatoon. So there's a series of changes in sections 59, 60, I think 61, which are intended to allow, to expedite the medical review panel process by allowing the chair to be from Regina or Saskatoon, and for the injured worker to provide a list of the specialists so that we don't have to keep going back and forth to the injured worker every time a potential specialist disagrees to be part of the medical review panel. So the majority of these changes are intended to make it easier for the worker to get to the medical review panel.
Is it also correct, though, to say that this change will only allow accepted claims to have access to a medical review panel?
That's a clarification. That's always been the case. And so it's a misunderstanding within trying to, when some workers will apply on the issue of acceptance or denial, but that's never been the case for a medical review panel. So the legislation is just making it clear what the medical review panel is intended for. They only deal with accepted claims.
So just again to clarify, currently, if WCB denies the initial acceptance of a claim, the worker is not able to access the medical review panel. And
That's correct.
Okay, and this legislation doesn't change that.
That's correct.
Okay. I'm moving on to section 15 of the bill, which amends section 66 of the legislation. This is around the awards for permanent functional impairment. Can you provide some detail as to what the changes in this bill?
So with this bill change, what it'll do is increase the amounts that are awarded to an injured worker who qualifies for permanent functional impairment. And it will increase from a minimum of 2,200 to a minimum of 4,000, and will go from a maximum of 45,200 to 82,200. And it is staged over, I think, 4 years of implementation, and then after that, it will be indexed to CPI.
How does this compare with other jurisdictions?
This puts us roughly in the middle of the pack.
Was that a concerted policy decision to be in the middle of the pack jurisdictionally?
No, we just simply looked at increases of certain types of benefits over time, and we increased this particular award based on the changes in benefits, certain other benefits. So proportionally, we've increased it to where, for example, the average weekly wage went up. Proportionally, this all kind of went up together with that.
I'm wondering if you can provide some similar information to about Section 16 of the bill, which amends Section 67. This is around the independence allowance.
The independence allowance was not part of the Committee of Review recommendations, but when we saw the changes to PFI, we realized that it would probably be a good idea to index the independence allowance. Those two issues were normally linked. We delinked them and then created an opportunity for the independence allowance to be indexed annually as well.
Can you explain how the independence allowance and the permanent functional impairment work with the definition of average weekly earnings in Section 70?
So it used to be linked to the average weekly wage, but we realized that there was you would disproportionately impact low wage earners for permanent functional impairment, and we felt that depending on the degree of impairment, each worker should receive the same amount regardless of what their base salary is. So we disconnected it to the average weekly wage, which means regardless of what you earn, each worker will receive the same amount for permanent functional impairment.
Thank you. Can you explain, I'm looking at Section 17 of the bill, which amends Section 70 of the legislation, why this subsection is being added? 70 sub 6 is the new one.
This is to address the fact that some secondary and post-secondary students that are working as part of their education or training, they won't have a salary to base their wages or their compensation from. So this gives us the authority to actually assign a wage to that student if they're injured, so we can pay them compensation related to their injury.
Thank you. I'm now looking at Section 23 of the bill, which amends Section 174 of the legislation. Could you please explain why these changes are being made? Legislation currently. So can you provide some reasoning as to why?
There was a few reasons this was amended. Some of it was just to create neutral language, communication, but the main point of the changes here is to improve the timelines around getting information to either party as it relates to an appeal. Because time is of the essence sometimes when you're talking about getting a decision to the injured worker or the employer.
Has there been some timeliness challenges within the WCB?
The challenge for this is the back and forth process and the timelines for each. So each step allows for up to 15 days for each party, and it can go back and forth. In total, that can add up to 30, 45, maybe 60 days while somebody's waiting for a decision. And so that can be very challenging, and we're one of the very few jurisdictions that allows a rebuttal by an injured worker, let alone 2 rebuttals. So we just thought we'd simplify the process for everyone.
And if anybody is wanting to do a rebuttal, for example, they do have the ability to access the workers' advocate if they're having concerns about timeliness, being able to get their information. Is that correct?
Yes, the workers' advocate is always available to assist a worker with any issue they have related to a claim.
Thank you. I have no further questions.
Thank you, Ms. Saar. Are there any more questions or comments from other committee members? Seeing none, we will proceed to vote on the clauses. Clause 1, short title. Is that agreed? Carried. Clause 2, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 3, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 4, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 5, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 6, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 7, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 8, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 9, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 10, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 11, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 12, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 13, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 14, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 15, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 16, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 17, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 18, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 19, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 20, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 21, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 22, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 23, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 24, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 25, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 26, is that agreed? Carried. Clause 27, coming into force, is that agreed? Carried. His Majesty, by and with the advice and consent of the Legislative Assembly of Saskatchewan, enacts as follows. The Workmen's Compensation Extending Firefighter Coverage Amendment Act 2023. I would ask a member to move that we report on Bill 138, the Workmen's Compensation Extending Firefighter Coverage Amendment Act 2023, without amendment.
Move.
Mr. Keating? Is that agreed? Carried. Minister, do you have any closing comments?
Yeah, thank you, first of all, to the opposition for the questions, to the government members for making this committee happen, and to all the officials for the great work that they have done. This is a very, very important file. It affects a lot of people. You hope it doesn't, but it does. And the great work that WCB and Labour do in the province. So thank you to the committee.
Thank you, Minister. Ms. Saar, do you have any comments?
I'd just like to join with the Minister in thanking yourself, Madam Chair, and the rest of the committee members for their work, and the officials for answering my questions this afternoon, first of all, very thoughtfully, as well as all of the work that you do, as well as all of the staff that you represent here for the people of the province every single day.
Thank you. That concludes our business today. I would ask a member to move a motion of adjournment. Mr. Norleen? All agreed? Carried. This committee stands adjourned to the call of the chair. Thank you.